Hi, and welcome to the School Health Educators podcast, where we discuss health education and how to best teach health ed in the K through 12 setting. Hi, and welcome to the School Health Educators podcast. I'm your host, Lori Reichel, and today is basically part two of going over the National Health Education Standard number 7. And for the first episode, the wonderful, incredible Jessica Butts was with me, and she is back. And in the first episode, well, before I continue, Jessica, would you say hi to everyone and remind everybody about what you do, who you are?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Lori, for having me back for part two. My name is Jessica Butts. I'm currently a middle school health teacher in a district in Westchester County, New York. I've been there since 2006. Prior to that, my work was as a campus health educator at a couple of different universities. And my first year of teaching in 2002 was in a middle school teaching a life skills class. However, as I shared in episode one, I really have always felt tied to a middle school because I don't like to hear when students say, oh, middle school, it's the worst years of my life, or any adult that I've spoken to about middle school. I want it to be the best years of their lives and where they can really benefit from learning everything that they learn and put it into practice as they grow up into their teenage years and then beyond into their young adult years. So I'm really happy to be back for part two to talk with Lori about the work that she's doing with her students at the college level and the current students that are training to become health educators. And thanks again for having me.
I thank you for being here again and for the first episode. And it was really neat when we connected through email. I had said, what might you be interested in talking about? And when you responded, I was thinking of the same thing. I was thinking of the national standard number 7, which we'll talk about in a moment.
Mhm.
And you have your way of teaching it that you're doing with the seventh graders. And I'm currently doing a unit in which my graduate students are working on a unit as a whole class as
Yes,
if they're teaching to high school
yes,
students. So
excellent.
before we continue, do you mind going over how the standards read on a
Sure,
variety of websites?
sure. So for standards in health education, we are so lucky to have several different resources available to us. So let's start with the CDC's website. So on their website, the standards for health education are described and identified as part of creating such an effective health curriculum. And so if you were to access those, you're going to be able to dive into what the standards read as and then get some ideas for updated content and information from the lens through the Centers for Disease Control. Second to that, and again, this is in no particular order, but another option might be to visit Shape America's website. And if you scroll down in the listing of standards to look specifically at Standard 7, you'd find that that standard reads students will demonstrate the ability to practice health enhancing behaviors and avoid or reduce health risks. And then finally, if you were to go to the National Consensus of School Health Education, which is also a great resource, you're going to find that they have listed different standards, and their website also includes some other connections to other organizations that work so hard in the world of health education. And in New York, we're really lucky, Lori, that we have the New York State guidance document that we utilize to make sure that our practices are not only updated content, but really skills based practices.
Thank you so much for going over those. And
You're welcome.
for this unit, I did explain to the students that are going to be they are future health teachers.
Mhm.
So they're going to be teaching in the pre-K to 12 setting, depending upon where they're hired. And I infused self-management and stress management together for the unit.
Mhm.
But before I jump into that unit, would you mind reminding us what the title of your unit for seventh graders is titled, as well as what the acronym stands for?
Yes, of course. So in the seventh grade health classes, we just started our healthy selfie work. And this learning experience can be summarized by that acronym selfie. We all know what a selfie is. We probably have a lot more selfies than we're willing to admit, but I tried to come up with something that our students could really connect with, and they all seem to be able to connect with selfies. So for this learning experience, the S stands for sleep, the E is exercise, the L is love, in other words, things or people that you love. F is food, I, intellect or intellectual, and E, emotions.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
What was really neat when we did the last episode is that you were going over things, and I'm like, I'm doing something like that with the graduate students, but it's to another level. It's
Yes.
because they're prepping this unit for high schoolers, and there is repetition, but it's more age appropriate for older students, infusing some other things. But we have the same purpose, in which
Yes.
we're providing life skills or everyday habits for people to use. So, and I find self management, or standard number 7, self efficacy skills or self enhancing skills,
Yes.
however people want to phrase it, I find that as a bunch of mini habits that you don't just work on in the future, you have to work on every day or every week, however that works. Would you
Correct.
agree?
I agree. And I always try to encourage my students to not think of these health enhancing behaviors as check off boxes. That, every single person has the ability to enhance health and well being, like you said, on a day to day basis, but it doesn't have to be set aside time that people carve out. It's in the things that we do anyway. But what this kind of learning experience, and I'm sure your learning experience will do, is to give students the ability to say, this is where I am now, but this is where I want to be. This is where I strive to be. And you can also put in a lot of goal setting and reflection, which I think is really important.
For my students, they're graduate level students working on a unit that could be used potentially in ninth to 12th grade. They're working with a partner to practice, like how to do lessons, how to write lessons, directions. But overall, we have 9 lessons that have been created, and then there'll be a summative assessment. So the overall rationale for the unit is that the students need to have a healthy relationship with themselves,
Mhm.
including their relationship with stress,
Yes.
as well as everyday habits to focus on. And it's really neat how our unit is coming together.
Mhm.
So Jessica said we have the national standards, and in New York we have a guidance document, and both the self management and the stress management is being infused here, because the reality is we don't have time to go over every single thing in health education. I use the phrase of, we can't shove a gorilla into Spanx, although a
Right.
lot of people try to, and I'll go over that in another episode. um, but we're the focus here, and I keep on going back to backwards design. What's the purpose is to provide simple skills
Mhm.
for both my college students to practice to be more successful, as well as their future high school students.
Amazing.
So the first lesson in this unit was about what is stress. It's
Mhm.
simply defining what stress is.
Mhm.
Because I don't know about your students, but I am so tired of hearing in the news or in like a commercial or something like, have stress, this is how you get rid of it. Stress isn't quote unquote bad. Stress is a part of life.
Yes. Yes. I like to tell my students when we first start talking about stress that I see it as a bicycle tire. And a bicycle tire needs a certain amount of air, but not too much
Yeah,
in order for it to turn and get that person to where they need to be or where they
yeah.
would like to be. But yet, if it doesn't have enough air, then they're not going to be able to go as fast. They're going to be a little bit more sluggish on the bicycle. And so finding the balance of how much stress and what kind of stress and how it's impacting my body and my mind is really important for not just the students I work with in a middle school, but like you said, your graduate level students and the high school students that they will be teaching.
So for this lesson, I first ask students, how do you define stress? And there are more negative connotations at times. And then we do this activity where they have to stand in the inside of a circle or the middle of a circle or the outside of the circle, depending upon how they think or feel about certain situations. So that they'd stand in the middle of the circle if I say a situation and they're like, yes, I love it, I want to do it. And
Mhm.
then they go to the middle where they're like, ah, whatever, does, whatever, I can do it. And then the outside is no, I don't want
Mhm.
to do it, have no
Mhm.
interest, no, I might have to do it, but I don't like it. And then I go through a variety of, if I say types of health sweeps of situations, uh, and they have to stand. So, like, for example, for social health, I'll say, talking to the cutie patootie who you've had a crush on for the longest time. And some people will stand in the center and some in the middle, and some like, no, it makes me
Mhm.
nervous. For mental health, taking a math exam, and they
Yes.
stand in a certain spot, and we go through a variety of situations. One of my least favorites, but favorites, is holding a snake. and
Mhm.
and for me, I'm on the outside, and others, they're
Yep.
like, yeah, it doesn't bother. So and so we do this activity, and I ask my students for other examples that are stressors. So
Yep.
stressors are anything that causes stress. And
Yes.
then we process that. Some people are in the middle of the circle for things, other people are on the outside. What does that
Yep.
tell us? That
Yes.
how we perceive these situations can tell us if we're going to feel eustress or distress.
That's right. That's right. I was going to say, I think that's so important and to understand, especially at a middle school level, that inside of the body, when we perceive stress as harmful, we're more likely to have a stress response.
Yes.
Whether we fight, flight, or freeze, it's going to physiologically change our behavior because that's how humans have evolved. And the different stressors that exist today aren't the same as they were, in the time of cave
Yep.
people. However, the physiological changes that occur can be the same if you think about the science behind it.
Exactly. Exactly. So from there, we go into lesson two, which is our bodies are so smart. And if you
Mhm.
look at the New York State guidance document, there's a statement that reads about students identifying bodily
Mhm.
signs slash
Yes.
symptoms. And
Yeah.
so that lesson really focuses on, well, there's an activity, it's a number activity where students actually have some stress put on them, but it's a safe form of stress. It's an activity where they have to write down the numbers that the teacher is reading off or another student is reading off, and the numbers get longer and longer.
Hmm.
And when we did it in class, I did a fake sneeze, and I did
Oh.
it purposefully because I wanted students to say afterwards, as we were processing, of that really irritated me. And I'm like, yes. And what did your body, how did your body respond? So they're
Mhm.
put under this activity where right afterwards they're asked to listen to their bodies.
Mhm.
And then we note who has the same feelings in their body, whose heart was racing, whose hands were getting sweaty. So it
Yes.
normalizes these things. And then
Yes.
we do a checklist. We sat in a circle to go over this checklist of what's typical for you.
Hmm.
What's typical for you might be not typical for someone else. And one of my favorite things I bring up that sometimes when we're really stressed is we have to urinate.
Yes.
And at first, students are like, what? And then I'm
Mm.
like, think about it. When you're going on in a car ride or for a car ride, and you're told, go to the bathroom,
Hmm.
you go to the bathroom, then you go into the car and you're like, oh, I got to go to the bathroom again.
Again. Again. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Totally.
It's because you can't. Or when you find the fantastic hiding place and you're so excited, but you're like, I
Yes.
got
Yes.
to go.
So true. So
So
true.
this is a very small skill, but it's something for people to recognize. Your body is telling us
Yes.
these signals so we
Yes.
can figure out how to cope with these signals, not cover them up.
Right.
From there, we go into a lesson. It's called SMEEPs of and Stress. And I've done this at the undergraduate level, I've done this at the high school level. And students are put into groups and they're provided an age group of like to try to figure out what are the common stressors for that age group. And I call it SMEEPs of, and that stands for social, mental, emotional, environmental, physical, spiritual, occupational, financial, depending upon the age group.
Yep.
And I like doing it as a little competition. They can call people if they want to. And age groups would range from elementary school to senior citizens.
Hmm.
Because there are some people that think that stress is going to end, or
Right.
as I get to a certain age, it's done. And
Right.
it's like,
Right.
no, no. And there's a very short YouTube clip. I'm forgetting her name. She's a basketball coach in North Carolina.
Oh.
And we showed that this past semester. She talks about how if you're waiting for things to get easier,
Hmm.
stop waiting because it
Yes.
doesn't
Right.
necessarily. We
Right.
get more resilient with our
That's
coping
right.
skills.
That's right.
And this is more of an individual unit in a way. If you think of theories, the health belief model is supported within this unit.
Hmm.
Um, at this point in the unit, an individual project is given for students to start logging their stressors for a week and how they cope. So they can start identifying, oh, these are my top stressors of the day. They might
Okay.
be a eustressor or a distressor. And then this is how I coped. Let's be honest. Did I hit the wall? Did I yell at my parents? That kind of thing.
Hmm. Hmm. And how many times have you gone through this particular learning experience?
I've done this a lot of times.
Hmm.
And I was going to say it at the end, but typically when I was at the high school level, we would do, things would change here and there.
Sure.
Yet one of the assessments within this unit was for students to work with a partner or two. They can also work individually to end our classes by teaching us a stress management technique.
Nice.
So, although I showed you 9 different lessons that we have here, every one of them, the students had to focus on a specific stress management technique. So,
Yes.
like the first one was a breathing, the second one, oh, I'm forgetting, I think it was another type of breathing,
Hmm.
but to show a variety because what works for you might not work for me.
That's right.
And when I've done this in the high school setting, and I try to like step aside, like I let students take over, but definitely for the end of each lesson, students would say, okay, this is the technique I'm going over today. They had to tell me ahead of time so we didn't
Yes.
have duplicates, but
Yes.
they'd be like, we're going to do some coloring. And here's the
Yes.
research behind coloring.
Yes. We do
And
something so similar. So this conversation is so interesting because these are the different skills that we also work on in a middle school. And I'm so glad to hear that there are people in high school settings and even college settings that are having this sort of repetition because it's so important, to have these experiences throughout their development. We start the year with stress management in seventh grade, and that's
wonderful.
exactly how what you're explaining. Our students give peer to peer examples and they demonstrate this works for me. It might not work for you, but let's just give it a try and we'll see how you feel after. So that's
Wonderful.
it's so wonderful to hear that this is such a collaborative experience.
It is. And the reality is, if a student's like, well, we did this, okay, let's switch it up. Because
Yes.
in a pre assessment, I can ask questions. And so, like for the next lesson, I had these students that presented it watch the rock activity with Stephen
Yep.
Covey.
Yes.
And it's all about time management. And
Hmm.
actually, another student of mine from years ago had said it's really not about time management, it's really about you
Hmm.
managing your time. It's not
Yes.
about the time, it's
Yeah.
about you
Yes.
and doing that value. Are you putting your values first in
Hmm.
your schedule, or are you allowing time wasters to take over?
Right. Yep. It's great.
So from there, another lesson is the realities of technology.
Hmm.
And the people that did this lesson a couple weeks ago, they actually had everybody go to their phone and then look at how long, like what their average amount of time on their phone is.
Hmm.
And then they did a poll everywhere. So they got to see this is what everybody's average time is. And if we look at, on our phones, and if we look at why we're on it, what's happening to our brains, they
Hmm.
brought in things about the dopamine being released. And they
Yes.
did it in a more student centered activity, though, where they were
Hmm.
doing a myth and a a true and a myth fact sheet, yet it was about the realities of how some people are addicted. Like,
Yes.
we know that the younger brain can get addicted to things faster.
Yes.
So we want to put that on the table for young people. And what was really neat was this lesson then went back to creating a weekly schedule where
Yes.
they were asked to make sure they schedule in tech free time.
Yes. I was going to say, I love how you title it The Relationship You Have with Technology, because whenever we're talking about relationships, whether they be friendships or dating relationships or what have you, we forget the relationships we have with our own selves and how,
Mhm.
that is just as important, if not more important, than the relationships we have with people around us.
Yes. Which is why I love New York State has that
Mm,
self management title, because it is really managing yourself.
that's right. Yep. So after that lesson on technology, what happens next?
Well, they continue to do their logs, and at a certain point, because a week would be passed and students would process and they'd be asked some reflection questions. But the unit begins to progress into, okay, so stress is a part of life.
Mhm,
We need to, we can be challenged by it in negative or positive manners. Yet we also need to recognize that at a certain point, especially during the teenage or preteen years,
mhm,
atypical responses to stress can start appearing. So
mhm.
the next lesson starts to identify what are typical versus atypical behaviors.
Right.
And it's presented in a manner where it's not like it's bad. It's that, okay, if this is happening, if you're seeing a friend that pauses before coming into a room and they're having to count to 100,
Yeah.
okay, so what's going on? Is this a person who maybe has seen this, observational learning? They're repeating something they've seen and it's
Mhm,
a control thing, they're feeling really stressed, or
mhm,
is this a sign of something else going on there where they might have a diagnosis?
mhm, mhm.
Which then goes into the next lesson of removing the stigmas of mental illness. And
Mhm.
that is from NAMI, the
Yes.
National Alliance of Mental Illness. I learned this over 25 years ago from
Mhm.
Long Island. And the group that put this together, they talked about, you put mental illness on the board. And how my group did this time was they put people into groups and they had to create an honest web of what are still some of the stigmas that exist for mental illness
Yes.
and how can we get rid of this,
Yes.
which, and I'm going to continue because of time,
Sure.
we continue with the uh how, so there are these stigmas with mental illnesses. They also talk about famous people that have said that they have a diagnosis to
Mhm.
normalize that this stuff happens.
Yes.
And then it's then going into how, if we have a family member or a friend that has a diagnosis, how do we cope with that?
Right. Right. And
You know,
we also are so lucky to work with our local chapter of NAMI, in fact, in seventh grade. And we work,
wonderful.
yes, and we work with them through the End the Silence program, which is
Yes.
you're describing it. And it's so important for our students to understand how far we've come, but yet how far we need to go. We're so lucky that we have
Yes.
that the hotline 988 that our students learn about, and that there's been so much that is done to support mental illness, but yet we all still need to be much more better advocates about it.
Hmm. Now, throughout this unit, I encourage my students to attempt to find instructional strategies, think about what was modeled to them in other classes, but that are more student centered. So it's not us lecturing, because if you note in this whole unit, students aren't being assigned a mental illness to do research on.
Right.
The reality is they don't need to do research on that. What we want them to do is to normalize that sometimes people have a mental illness.
That's right.
So how can you get support for yourself or a friend, a family member, as well as how to cope? How do you make sure you're taking care of your bodies? We
Hmm.
know that mental illnesses, the causes of that can be genetics. It can be because of a trauma, whether it be a physical thing, an emotional thing. It can be because of substance use. Sometimes
Hmm.
using a certain substance like marijuana can trigger something, especially if you're more genetically prone to it. So it's not having students do reports. It's actually going about it in a different way. So if you look at the functional health knowledge, it's
Mhm.
removing all the heavy facts. It's
Yes.
removing that, in which the last lesson for this unit is about suicide and
Mhm.
about the signs of suicide. The activity for this, I asked the students to go back to something I've done, and that is having students watch the video from Blind Melon called No Rain.
Okay.
It is one of my favorites for this topic because have you ever seen it, Jessica?
No, I have not seen it.
It's this girl who is wearing a tutu, like a bumblebee outfit, like a
Okay.
tutu and everything. And she starts off, she's on a stage and she's tap dancing.
Mhm.
And she's probably about 12-ish in this. And so she does this tap dance, and then whoever's in the audience starts laughing at her and she starts
Oh.
looking sad. And
Mhm.
throughout the video, it's like she's trying to tap dance for others. And this theme of the video is she's trying to figure out where she belongs,
Mhm.
which all of us go through that. Who do we connect with? Where do
Mhm.
we we're in different groups at times. We have different interests. And towards the end of the video, within 2 minutes of the video, she goes into this field and she sees behind this gate other people wearing bumblebee costumes.
Ah,
And she has the hugest smile
that's so
and she
cute.
goes running to them. And it's some of the band members as well as others wearing the costumes.
Mhm.
So, and we process, okay, so what's the point? Think, pair, share. What is this? And we're trying to bring in music too, because so many young people love music.
Yes.
And after they see this one, they can identify other songs that have a similar message, like we all want to belong.
Yes.
After they watch this, they then have to pay attention to the lyrics, in which the lyrics, it talks about like having pain and wanting it to rain. And there's a lot of signs that the people that wrote it potentially weren't feeling happy. They
Mm.
potentially were thinking of hurting themselves.
Okay.
And I believe the lead singer, there's a controversy about how he passed on,
Okay.
but I always say to students, do sometimes artists share how they're feeling,
Mhm.
just like we do in other ways, like through music.
Yes.
And again, students will refer to, oh, yeah, this artist sings this song and they've been diagnosed with this.
Sure. Sure.
So, this whole unit again is giving a bunch of skills of, having a positive relationship with stress or using our bodies to identify stress. Let's
Mhm.
start having coping skills in which they're challenged to even do breathing exercises 10 minutes a day, because we know that lowers the cortisol. But
Yes.
then the other life skills of how do I recognize what's typical, atypical? How do I make sure I don't continue a stigma for mental
Mhm.
illness?
Yes.
How do I cope with a family member, a friend? If somebody shows me a sign of suicide, what do I do?
Mhm.
And what's the resource? Like they do that finger, the
Yep.
hand, where
Yes.
they have to outline their hand and then they identify on each finger a
Yes.
resource to go to, and
Mhm.
they're in the middle, and because they're so important.
Yes.
So
That
that's
sounds
the
so
unit.
nice. Yeah, it sounds incredible. And it's too bad that we couldn't somehow align so that my seventh graders that I have now will somehow end up, working through this unit that you're presenting to your graduate students.
Oh, we have to do that in the future.
You do. You do.
Oh my goodness.
We'll have to connect them somehow. Like back in the day, it was like you took a Spanish 5 course, but yet your teacher was across the country somewhere else. Distance learning, they called it. And now,
Yes.
yes, and now we have many more means to do those kinds of things.
Yes. So, like we said, like the first episode for this month
Mhm.
was Jessica going over her unit,
Mhm.
focusing on Standard 7. And this is a unit I've just done with my college folks for high schoolers. And it's so neat to see similarities
Mhm.
And some differences, of course, is going to be age appropriate.
That's right.
Yet, do you have any last words of advice before we end on this episode for our colleagues out there teaching to Standard 7?
I think that for standard 7, it's really important that we give students the opportunities to practice again those little behaviors that add up and make a big difference in their health and well-being, and to not make it seem like these kinds of practices are going to take extra work that they might already say I don't have time for. But
Yes.
it's encouraging students to be independent and have the ability to practice their health enhancing behaviors and to stay safe because they have the means to do so. It doesn't have to be something that's all spelled out. So I think it's a super important skill, and that standard 7 is something that we need to all make sure that we ourselves as the adults working with the students also practice and demonstrate.
Yes. And I say to my students, the practicing of those exercises, like simply being present, breathing exercises for
Mhm.
10 minutes a day, even if it's 5 times a week that you can do it, your cortisol level typically goes down. That's what the research tells us.
Mhm.
And you also react differently. And you might
Yes,
think, I don't have the time. You do have the time.
you do. You do.
You do.
Yes. We multitask in so many other ways in our lives. So if we can multitask with a health enhancing behavior, why not? Why not try it and see those benefits?
Yeah. Jessica, how can people get in touch with you?
The best way to contact me is via my work email. I will spell it out for you. So it's Jessica, Jessica .butts, just like your backside, as my kids don't like to hear me say, at chufsd.org.
And I'll make sure I put that email address in
Wonderful.
today's description. Thank you
Wonderful.
again for being here. Would you like to say goodbye to our listeners for the
I
day?
would. Thank you so much for having me, Lori. Thank you so much for listening, all of you out there. Keep doing what you're doing. I believe in you, and I know your students do too.
Yes. We thank you so much for listening in, and some reminders for you. Please follow this podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Also, check out the schoolhealtheducators.org website. And remember, you make a difference, you matter. Thanks so much for doing what you do, and stay well.